Today I'm going to be reading from my latest book, Aspecting the Goddess, and I'm reading from the Ereshkigal section. Ereshkigal is queen of the Underworld in the Sumerian mythos. Dark sister to glorious Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, Ereshkigal's part in Inanna's descent to the Underworld brought death, at least temporarily, to that bright goddess. As Inanna heads blithely into the Underworld to see her sister, Ereshkigal laughs and plans her death. Gate by gate as Inanna descends, her powers, finery and precious ornaments are stripped away from her, and she is constantly reminded the ways of the Underworld are perfect. When she reaches Ereshkigal's hall, naked by now, she is killed by a word and a look from the Queen of Death, and then hangs on a meat hook for 3 days and nights until she is rescued. Alone among the dead, Ereshkigal cries and moans and screams, engaged in an immense and lonely labour. Ereshkigal. Say her name in syllables, sound it out with tongue against the roof of the mouth, letting the lips form each shape in turn, like a Japanese word with no emphasis, each piece as deadly as the next. Ereshkigal. Spoken on a low and rusty note, a foretaste, a warning bell. Resh, a susurrus of whisper in the dark background. Ki, like the knife that cuts the life thread, and by now we know there's no turning back. Gal, the sound of the Underworld, of those gates slamming behind one, clang after clang, echoing in unending dropping darkness with no way back. Ereshkigal. What is it like to live in a tomb, a place of the dead, even if a palace, to be living, immersed in death? Surely each one of us can answer that. This service to the dead by the living, I have done that. I remember driving 4 hours on a hot summer's Boxing Day with a reluctant partner to the funeral of a friend's only child. There was nothing I could offer but my presence, which was less than nothing in the face of what had happened, and yet dozens of us went, not just for her, who must keep living, but in tribute to a life surrendered. 70 of us trekked along a rough track across a creek and through the bush, leading to a hole dug in the ground by his family and friends. His coffin not just carried by the men who had cared for and followed him, but also made by them, physically, from wood and metal, in the last days of his dying. My friend Kate said, as she sat with her son, she could hear them under the house, banging and sawing as they did this work. She said she found it reassuring. That task of hers, to sit by her dying child as his coffin was crafted and listen to the sounds of it. Most of us would think that hell. The mood dropped and dropped through the service for this child, standing in the Australian sun with a backdrop of tall gum trees, the earth clay under our feet, his school class singing for him, people speaking prayers and wishes. When they started to lower the coffin into the ground, not a neat gap in a polite cemetery with marble, mowed lawns and brass plaques, but a pit, a hole in the rough clay. I felt a tide, a wave, sink through me. Many, most, were crying. How to reason with this? How to make space or say this was all right or an end to suffering when surely the suffering of his parents had just begun? Then one brave person stepped forward and opened his mouth and began to sing loudly, Halle, halle, hallelujah. He sang with conviction and invitation, Halle, halle, halle. And more of us joined in, Halle, 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 gulping back the tears because this surely was a way to redemption. Luya. A way to have the pulse of the living enter even the halls of the dead, to turn this bleak tide and reforge with each other the breath and spirit of life. Hallelujah, hallelujah, which lasts as long as it lasts, and apparently goes on lasting, even in the face of death. Ereshkigal. I met her once. The patterns of her run through my life. Dark queen of mystery. Once we say the underworld, I feel it potent everywhere beneath my feet. It's not a precise location, not bordered or limited or confined to any particular place. It is just below. This constant presence hovering out of sight but not out of mind, waiting for its moment. This seemed to be always with me. As a child, I was terrified of it. I felt its jaws were close to me, and any moment of inattention on my part could result in obliteration. Fairy tales, especially those of Baba Yaga, snow queens, or wicked witches, of girls entering impossibly dark places and somehow winning through, compelled me. Persephone with her secrets hinted at in that flower, that pomegranate, that story never really let go of my imagination. When I read the story of Inanna and Ereshkigal in my mid-20s, I felt it had been calling me all my life. Here then was the mystery stripped to its death, stripped to its essential form. Here were the steps laid out to enter the world of death and even return. Here was invitation. Here was certainty. I have been in service to death my whole life. We all are. When I was 4, my mother's father died after a long illness. I cannot say if it was the day he died or the day after or the day after that, and I cannot ask my mother because she is dead as well. Before she went out for the day, she pulled me aside and spoke to me. I remember it well. She had my whole attention. I think she must have squatted down to my level and looked me in the eye, held me accountable. She said my grandmother was coming to look after my brother and me, and that we must be kind to her. I think she said that my grandfather, Paul, had died, though perhaps I did not take that in as fully as the instruction to be kind, this very serious instruction. I was not clear at that age of people's relationships to each other, so I did not realize she was telling me her own father, whom she loved deeply, had died. We were kind that day to my grandmother. I remember the sense of it rather than the particulars. My brother must have been not yet 3, so it was my responsibility. I think we read books together. That is, she read to us. I think we cuddled her and played outside by ourselves and let her do whatever she did alone in the house. I remember the largeness of it, an enormity I knew was beyond my reach, and yet somehow it impacted right down to a place small enough to contain me. A morning and afternoon in a suburban house with a woman and 2 children. I remember it feeling completely beyond my grasp, and yet my role in it was precise, understandable, and punctiliously performed. Maybe the presence of her grandchildren brought my grandmother comfort, or at least distraction. I know we did not talk about death or about my grandfather, and I knew my role was to be performed without commentary, behind the scenes. I was not to explain that we were being deliberately kind or ask questions. I was just to do it. Once, in London, I saw an amazing piece of theatre by the Opera Factory that spanned through the Sumerian mythology. Perhaps the first half was the story of Inanna and the second half that of Gilgamesh. 3 images are burned into my memory from that play, and in a way they are all images of death. The first is of Enkidu, the wild man designed by the gods who lived with the beasts of the field before Gilgamesh found him, tamed him and became his brother, all of which led to Enkidu's death. The theatre company arrayed themselves out across the stage, which was simply the back half of a broad room, and they became animal. They were a herd of gazelles, maybe, with Enkidu among them. It was a perfectly choreographed dance that was not a dance. They conjured up between them the grass of the plains, the wind when it shifted, a sense of the herd and the moment unspelled of life. An aliveness entered that was not calculated or reserved, that was absolute land and animal, breath and grass and being. This, it was made clear, this was what was stolen from Enkidu when they tamed him, when they civilized him. This wild, being alive right now, was lost when he became a man like other men, like Gilgamesh, concerned with the past and the future, and so given already to Ereshkigal's halls. Ereshkigal. I remember her. The scene was dark, with loud, discordant music and what looked like buckets of red paint thrown about. Ereshkigal lay high up against the back wall on a series of ledges on her back, her naked legs splayed open up the wall, with her head dangling back off the ledge, screaming. She shone in the dull light with red. I think parts of her body may have been wrapped in plastic wrap, and the wet paint spilled over it. I remember being faintly surprised she was played by a young, slender, white woman. She screamed and screamed, not nicely or in an ordered way, with breath and pause between screams. She screamed as if she was giving birth to the world, and each piece of it had to be borne through her with all that entailed, all of the bloody dragging and tearing, all of that surrender. Out to life, and therefore also the turmoil and pain of death. It was unrelenting. I can't recall if anything else at all happened in that scene. I have a vague idea that dark minions scuttled about performing services, but I recall her in the absolute grip of composite creation, the sound we were born from. She was terrifying. Not the elegant birthing of stars, although perhaps that also, but the bloody, earthy birth of this planet through endless volcanic eras and seismic shifting, plates of continents colliding, electrical storms bathing the surface of the earth, searing and igniting, the upthrust of seabed and the collapse of mountain ranges, glaciers and geysers and tsunamis, earthquakes and the forces needed to turn coal to diamond, the ages to petrify rock and fossilize tiny sea beings, to wear boulders to sand, receive the impact of meteorites and the passing dissemination of comets, to heat and ice over, to melt, to birth life itself out of this cauldron. Life. Imagine all the lives. Of the algae, of the single-celled, of the bacteria, slime molds, viruses, mosses and insects, seaweed and coral and crustaceans and shellfish and fish, of plants, of fungi and bracken, of herb and fruit growing and flowering, of conifer and nut bearing, of grass, of bird, of animal, lizard, mouse, antelope, tiger, kangaroo, bat, dolphin, of each human. Imagine giving birth to all that. That's what Ereshkigal conjured for me. Then the gods. They are given birth to as well in the stories, from older gods, older ideas, older cultures. Back and back to the beginning times, and Ereshkigal seemed to me to be birthing that, the beginning. That was why it was so unending, why it went on forever, although, as humans, we could only glimpse a little piece of that, maybe the sound of our own mothers giving birth to us, or maybe a background music that sounded through our days and nights, a birth to death, until finally it swallowed us again. No wonder Inanna was overwhelmed. No wonder she was struck dead with horror or magnificence, to be put on a meat hook until she absorbed the sound of that, seasoned by it, marinated in it, until she was able to take a piece of it back with her into the upper daylight realms and wreak destruction with it there. The third image is of Gilgamesh with the flower of immortality. He was played by a tall, angular black man. He ran the endless distances required of this role, round and round in big loops on the stage for 10 minutes at a time, effortlessly. The flower was pushed on stage. It was encased in a tall box of glass or maybe clear perspex, 6 feet high and filled with water. I think they filled it on stage with a hose. The flower of immortality was down the bottom, something like a water lily. Gilgamesh heaved himself up the side of the box and dropped down into it. His clothes floated up around him as he fought the water to get low enough to pick the flower. It was elegant, timeless, suspended slow motion, watching him turn, head down and reaching out, reaching for perfection, for godhood, for the dream of never having to die. Death. I've been in service to it all my life. We all have. My grandmother's funeral, she died in her 90s. We went into the viewing room before. She lay there quiet, composed. Damon wanted her to be holding flowers, so we took a stem of gladioli from a bouquet someone had sent, and he and I arranged her cold, stiff hands around it. He was 6 years old. We did everything, my mother, myself and Damon, made speeches and asked up other speakers. I taught and led the song. Damon lit the candles with tapers and recited poetry. My grandmother let us do it all, in a way she never would have, alive. The day of my mother's funeral, Damon, now 22, and I went to the viewing I had insisted on. Now it was my mother who lay in the coffin. She looked small, plain. Living, she had a very animated face, now stilled. We stood beside her and recited the charge of the star goddess, our voices slipping and word for word catching, eyes gazing at each other, at my mother, hands clinging together, the living. We spoke it to give her into the hands of the goddess before the ceremony, which was non-religious or not so obviously pagan as to have room for us chanting the words of the goddess, the dust of whose feet are the hosts of heaven. And, for behold, I have been with you since the beginning, and I am that which is attained at the end of desire.